Senator O'Neill. Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Today we farewell one of the nation's greatest leaders, Bob Hawke, and many of the contributions that have been made today in this place I obviously want to associate myself with, and I think it's an amazing testament to this man's life that whatever side of the political spectrum you come from, you can recognise and must be able to see the true leadership that Bob Hawke gave our nation, not just when he was Prime Minister, but also continued well beyond. Bob was a man who was relatable as he was visionary. I remember being 6 or 7-year-old and living in country Victoria and deciding that I was going to write to our Prime Minister, that I was going to write to Bob Hawke. And the reason why, as a young girl, I felt empowered to do this was because the Prime Minister that I knew was somebody who listened, that engaged with the community, that sought to be part of everybody's everyday Australia. I didn't think it was weird that as a 6 or 7-year-old I would take pen to paper and write to my Prime Minister. I wrote to him about wanting to save the Victorian forests. I lived in country Victoria and it was a raging debate, and I wanted him to know how important the forests were to me and my family. To be honest, I don't know if I ever got a response. I don't recall that. But I do remember distinctly sitting down, writing that letter, and then proudly telling my dad that I was going to go and post it. Prime Minister Hawke is remembered for many things, among them his thoughtfulness on the great human rights challenges of his time. He successfully lobbied the Commonwealth to change tactics to pressure the apartheid in South Africa. Trade sanctions weren't working, so he called for a boycott of foreign investments. A big call, a big decision to make, but it was critical in dismantling the apartheid regime. And of course, we cannot forget the actions that Prime Minister Hawke took in the wake of Tiananmen Square and the massacre that occurred there. Prime Minister Hawke defied advice and convention to speak from the heart about what had just happened in the wake of the massacre. And it wasn't just rhetoric. His actions resulted in 40,000 Chinese being able to stay here in Australia and making this their home. Reflecting on those decisions years later, Bob said, "It's called leadership. I had no consultation with anyone, and I walked off the dais and I was told, quote, 'You can't do that, Prime Minister.' I said to them, 'I just did, and it's done.' And that's leadership. He knew what was right, and he acted. This is a lesson for all of us. His moral and human leadership defined him. His ability to show strength, yet empathy and compassion. That's what made Bob Hawke a unique leader in this country. And in a time of unrest in our region, the lessons that he shows us are lessons we must heed now, more than ever before. I was thinking about the Tiananmen Square decision and his ability to act with conviction, with strength, and yet compassion and empathy. And it's of course been 30 years since the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Only in the last month we've acknowledged the 30th anniversary. And for those watching the television news last night, the images of what's coming out of Hong Kong right now, and not one word seems to be uttered by our current government. Very little is being said by politicians here in Australia. I was thinking, when I was sitting here listening to the other contributions earlier this morning, what would Bob Hawke do? Would he simply sit back and stay silent, seeing the rise and cry for democracy in Hong Kong? I don't think he would. I think he would stand up. He'd acknowledge that struggle. He'd be diplomatic, of course, but he would not shy away from the right of the Hong Kong citizens to call for and fight for their democratic rights. The leadership from Bob Hawke on these moral and ethical challenges is something I think we all need to reflect on in the wake of his death. I attended the memorial in Sydney, along with many of my colleagues in this place, only a few weeks ago. And it was an amazing celebration of Bob Hawke's life. But it was more than that. It was an amazing celebration of our nation, what makes our country great. Bob loved Australia. He loved Australians. He showed that you could lead with strength and heart, both at the same time. As I sat in the memorial, I was struck by the words of his granddaughter, Sophie Taylor Price. And in 1989, 30 years ago, she sat on his knee while he gave a national television address. It was to commemorate World Environment Day. And he said in that nationally televised address, "We don't inherit the planet, we borrow it. Not simply for ourselves, but for our kids and their kids." Like Sophie here, referring to his granddaughter. How successfully she and other Australian children can fulfil their goals depends on how we look after our environment and how we best use this planet and its natural resources. This was 30 years ago, and Bob Hawke, as Prime Minister, was asking us to think much more cleverly and clearly about how we think about our natural world and the resources it offers. Bob Hawke didn't just talk the talk, he walked it. And we know that there is a long list of special, precious places here in Australia that have been saved and protected because of the leadership of Prime Minister Hawke. In the days after his death, former Greens leader Bob Brown penned a heartfelt and genuinely sad but celebratory opinion piece, a reflection of how Bob had experienced working with and during the time of Bob Hawke's leadership. Sometimes his ally and sometimes his adversary. Bob Brown wrote, "A Hawke masterstroke was to accept the proposal of the Australian Conservation Foundation's Philip Tone and the National Farmers Federation Rix Farley to set up Landcare. This became a beacon of global interest in government-funded repair of rural lands and rivers. That Landcare and general environment spending has been gutted in recent years highlights the loss of vision in Canberra since the great environmental innovation era Hawke ushered in." Bob continues, "Key to Hawke's environmental success was his listening ear. He knew the Australian public was keen on protecting nature and made himself open to direct liaison with environmental leaders. He was a tough negotiator, but he and his staff opened an ear to the environment." Bob Brown reflects on not only was it Bob Hawke's leadership as Prime Minister, but the decisions he made about who he involved in his cabinet. And one of the most impressive, hardened, deliberate conviction environment ministers this country has ever seen was Graham Richardson, under the leadership of Bob Hawke. Graham and Bob knew that if they were to save special parts of the Australian landscape, to send a message that protecting the environment was important, they had to listen to the community. But the advice that Bob Hawke and Graham Richardson gave the environment movement at that time was that you must roar. The crowd must roar for us to be able to act. And I think in the wake of this past election and this time of reflection, those words are now more important than ever. Those across this country who care deeply about our natural environment, about what our planet looks like in years to come, about the future of our children. Being despondent is not the answer. Standing up, speaking out and hearing you roar, your voice, your compassion, your love for your country. Bob Hawke called our community to do that when he was Prime Minister. And we need people to do it now. If you care about saving our country's greatest river network, the Murray-Darling Basin, if you care about protecting the Great Australian Bight, if you want the Great Barrier Reef to be there for your grandchildren, we need to hear you roar. Don't be despondent. Don't be depressed. Stand up and demand the type of leadership that Bob Hawke had. You can be both strong and compassionate and believe in the beauty and the strength of this nation all at once. No one would doubt Bob Hawke's love for Australia, for its people and its environment, and he wore that love with pride. I think, upon reflection of the great leadership from Bob Hawke, wearing that love of our country with pride is what we could all take on to honour his legacy. The moral leadership, the conviction, doing what is right because it's right, not because it's easy, making those decisions to speak up for fellow human beings, but taking the decision to protect this world for the next generation. That's the legacy. That's the legacy that I know myself, my generation, and many others in this place will continue as we reflect on the life of Bob Hawke. Vale Bob Hawke.
Thank you, Senator Hanson-Young.